My name is Joe Wehinger. This is Daily Ovation. Thank you for watching. In this episode, Jim Clarke walks us through some more wines as we learn more about the wines, the culture, the background, the history.
Is probably as typical a South African Chenin as you can get. This is Ken Forrester. Ken Forrester was a restaurateur in Johannesburg, and in the early 90s he was down in the Cape Town area and he was visiting properties and tasting wine, and he actually went to out of curiosity, so he says, to a land auction. Dragged his wife and said, let's just see what's going on. It's very curious, all these farms and things like that. And he walked out with the property, which has now become the Ken Forrester Vineyards. And he really believed in Chenin Blanc at a time in South Africa when a lot of people were thinking of ripping it up. A lot of the Chenin that is there was not necessarily there to make the best wines in the world. It was there to make either brandy or kind of that off-dry, what we would call gallo jug wine. And you joke about that, but that is the South Africans, for better or for worse, made that style. And by which I mean no one made it before them. They took two technologies. One that was developed elsewhere, which is that sterile filtration. In the 1930s, we finally learned how you could filter out yeast so that you could have a little bit of sugar left in your wine and it wouldn't re-ferment in the bottle. The next thing was what the South Africans developed, which is cool temperature fermentation. Those jackets that you see around a stainless steel tank these days, that idea of using that or either a plate that's stuck inside the tank to cool off the fermentation was invented in South Africa in 1952. So when you take those two things, a little bit of sweetness and then a cool temperature fermentation, which creates those kind of fun fruity flavors you get in those wines, that was a winning combination that no one had ever seen before in the 1950s. The biggest brand in mid-1960s was a brand called Lieberstein, making exactly that sort of style. Biggest brand in the world. It was South African. Unfortunately, it's not a style that lends itself to really quality premium winemaking. So that kind of led the industry down a road where they really focused on making what they call cheap and cheerful wine. We don't see that very much here in the U.S. South Africa actually has a pretty good average price point as far as commanding a good price in the market. But in much of the world, South Africa still has a reputation for being cheap and cheerful. If you're in the UK, you will see that they think of South African wine often the way that we think of Australian wines, or at least we thought of Australian wines, let's say. And I'm generalizing here, but if you need a cheap $8 wine, go to Australia. Well, over there, if you need a cheap £3, £5 wine, you'd think of South Africa historically. So that's something the South Africans are really working to overcome in those markets, because you can't make money making that kind of wine anymore. Here in the U.S., we don't really see that very much. Most of the South African wines you'll see will be above the 10-point mark, and much of it, a lot of it's being sold in that $12 or $15 to $20 range. That's kind of the more typical price for a South African wine these days. This actually goes for about $17. This is his Old Vine Reserve. It's 38-year-old vines. The secret to taking those old Chenin vines and making this kind of wine with it is to lower the yields. One of the things that the South Africans liked historically when they were making that cheap and cheerful wine was that you could get 30 tons per hectare out of Chenin vineyards. That's a lot of grapes hanging on each vine, tons of clusters. And you can make a pleasant wine that way. This is done with 6 to 8, actually this vintage is 4 to 6 tons per hectare. All right, so 1/5 the production out of the vines. And that means instead of diffusing the flavors, they're concentrated, and you can get a balanced, intensely flavored wine. The reason I say this is kind of a signature or the core style for South African Chenin Blanc is you have some that are lighter and crisper, I think like the Spear. You have some that are really rich and oaky. This is in between. It's got about 20% new oak. What I love about it and what I see happening in the market, and this is what I used to do when I was a sommelier in New York City, was this time of year, you have 30 people over, you have 50 people over, and you want to have one white and one red because you want to keep life simple, right? This is your white. If you serve Chardonnay, your Sauvignon Blanc drinking friends hate you, and vice versa. But if you serve this, it has enough body and roundness for the Chardonnay drinker. It's aromatically generous for the Sauvignon Blanc drinker, and it has freshness, so the Pinot Grigio drinkers are happy. And these are your kind of 3 basic kind of white wine drinkers. Now, if they want Riesling, it's not going to have a typical Riesling sweetness, so you miss that. But you can satisfy a large portion of your guests with this. And I've talked to retailers about this. I've talked to somms. And I think now they're realizing that when someone comes in saying, I have 50 people coming, they're saying, I need a South African Chenin. the retailer knows when someone comes in and asks for a New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc, they ask for a New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc. But we're not there yet with South Africa. This is how South Africa is getting its foot in the door with consumers and why it's going on the list in restaurants and going on the shelf in retailers. And I think this is a very typical example of that.